Hello everyone, what is up? It is me, AlbyMTG, and today I have another tournament report for you guys. I played in a PPTQ yesterday. There was 62 players, and of course I did well enough to make a video about it. There were a lot of interesting matches, a lot of interesting matchups, and hopefully you guys will enjoy it. So the deck that I played was Green Black Rock. This is the deck that I played in last week's PPTQ as well. You guys know from if you watched that video that I top 8'd that one as well. I was the 1 seed after the Swiss, and then lost my first round of the top 8 to probably my worst matchup, if not like one of my worst matchups. Just Tron is not good for this deck. We don't really have a ton to deal with it outside of like 4 Field of Ruins and then some sideboard cards. But this week I was hoping to avoid Tron. This is basically the same 75 I played in last week's PPTQ. The only difference being one Grafdigger's Cage instead of one Nihil Spellbomb. One of my friends I was trying to figure out what my last sideboard slot was. I kind of wanted to keep in the Nihil Spellbomb. I was actually thinking about taking out Pithing Needle, and then my friend, we were going through all the sideboard cards that he had on him, and Grafdigger's Cage I felt like was probably going to end up being better for this tournament, especially with all the Vengevine decks going around, and Hollow One, it's very good against Hollow One as well. So I chose to play Grafdigger's Cage over Nihil Spellbomb. Aside from that, the other 74 cards are exactly the same as the list that I ran last week. And so without further ado, we'll go ahead and get into it. So my first round was against Sun and Moon. This is kind of like a red-white control deck. It tries to win the game with Planeswalkers like Chandra, Torch of Defiance, Nihiri the Harbinger, and Gideon Jura. It basically locks your opponent out of the game by using cards like Chalice of the Void and Blood Moon as ways to kind of get free wins against some of the decks in the format, and then of course just trying to control the board as well. 4 copies of Anger of the Gods, 1 Day of Judgment, 3 Wrath of God here in this list. Of course, I don't have my exact opponent's lists for, this tournament. So all the lists that we're doing here are lists that I got off of MTG Goldfish. They're just sample lists of essentially what I was playing against. They're not the exact 75, but you guys get the picture. So I ended up winning this match 2-1. The Blood Moons don't really do a ton against me. I fetch basics pretty regularly, and I was pretty much, in a decent spot at all points. Blood Moon, like I said, just doesn't really affect me because I can fetch basics a lot, and I have like removal spells for it too. Maelstrom Pulse and Abrupt Decay both get rid of the Blood Moon, so it doesn't really affect me too much. The biggest deal is trying to, beat these Planeswalkers, Chandra, Torch of Defiance, Nihiri, and Gideon Jura. But after I, could handle them, then I was in a fantastic position. Ended up winning that one 2-1, as I said. The only game I lost was unfortunately because Emrakul came at me. It was my opponent at one point had Chandra, Torch of Defiance, Nihiri the Harbinger, and Gideon Jura all out on the battlefield at the same time. And so needless to say, I lost that game, and Emrakul ended up, coming out that game, beating me. But I did win Game 3 after winning Game 1 as well. So I'm, 1-0 after round 1 here against Sun and Moon. Round 2, I play against Black Red Holo One here. Black Red Holo One, of course, is trying to do ridiculously broken things with Goblin Lore, Burning Inquiry, Faithless Looting, and Street Wraith as ways to discard cards. And so then you can cast free or at least very cheap Holo Ones, and you're filling up your graveyard pretty fast, so you can get things like Bloodghast in your graveyard, and where is Gurmag Angler as well. You can delve away some of the cards that don't really matter anymore and just have these big 5/5 creatures. I ended up winning this one as well. I won this one 2-0. In game 1, my opponent my opponent didn't know what I was on, so she kept kind of a hand that was not great against me, but was probably okay against some of the different decks in the format. So game 1, I just got there, and then in game 2, I just pretty much had it again. Stopped her, fairly easily. I believe I had a Grafdigger's Cage at one point, and I had 2 Obstinate Baloths, so very, very good cards for the matchup. I think I had a Kalitas as well, so I was just drawing some good sideboard cards against her, and so I took down this one 2-0. So just like that, 2-0 in this tournament. Feeling pretty confident going into the next round. However, because there is 62 players, we're playing 6 rounds of Swiss cut to a top 8, but 62 is like extremely close to the 64 player cutoff that it would be for 6 rounds. So I'm going to need a very good record in this tournament if I want to top 8. And so that's also just kind of sticking in the back of my mind. I need to be 5-1 or better. 5 wins, 1 loss. That should be good enough. Outside of that, 4-2 probably not good enough, and 4-1-1 also probably not good enough. It's like right on the brink of getting in. But I really wanted to be 5-1 just to be safe. And so in game 3 in match 3 I should say, I played against the new black-red Vengevine deck. It's an extremely good deck. I lost game 1. My opponent didn't do super broken things, and I had a Scavenging Ooze in game 1, but overall, he just ended up getting there with, just bringing back a bunch of creatures, and I couldn't really deal with all of them, and then I think a Walking Ballista finished me off. Game 2, I ended up getting there because I had the Grafdigger's Cage, and I also had Damping Sphere, which is extremely good against this opponent as well. Again, you would normally think Damping Sphere is only a card that you would bring in against Storm and Tron, but against this opponent, it overperformed quite a lot. The Vengevines, in order to bring back the Vengevines from your graveyard, you have to cast 2 creature spells. Normally this is done by doing Hangerback Walker for 0, Walking Ballista for 0, and even sometimes Endless One for 0 as well. So it's just free ways to cast creature spells, have them go right to the graveyard, bring back your Vengevines, and attack very quickly. So the Damping Sphere really slows down their plan of playing all these cheap creatures, and the deck's not playing many lands at all, 17 lands, and most of them are fetch lands, so I was able to just kind of, make my opponent have to spend more mana on their spells than what other opponents would make them do because of the Damping Sphere, and I won game 2. And then in game 3, my opponent was on the play because I won game 2. My opponent goes turn 1, Faithless Looting, discard 2 Vengevines, and at this point, I realize I'm dead. There is no way I can beat this. So then I play like a fetch land and then pass the turn, and my opponent goes Hangerback Walker, Hangerback Walker for 0, Insolent Neonate, or no, not Hangerback Walker for 0, sorry, goes Insolent Neonate plus Goblin Bushwhacker to bring back the 2 Vengevines. So at this point, my opponent has 10 power on the board. He just hit me for 8 points of damage, and I still only have one land in play. So I am very dead at this point. And so this is where I pick up my first loss of the tournament. This puts me to 2-1 then overall, so this was like my 1 loss to give. I have to win out the rest of the tournament if I'm hoping to make the top 8. After this, I play against Affinity. Affinity is just a very sweet artifacts deck, very aggressive, and I ended up getting there 2-0 against my Affinity opponent. In game 1, they went pretty much all in on the Infect plan, using Inkmoth Nexus and trying to put some counters on it with Arcbound Ravager. So at one point, he had me up to 8 Infect, and I made a very risky play. So it was turn 3. My opponent has me at 4 Infect, and I have a Field of Ruin in hand, and I have a Tireless Tracker, and I have a 4th land. And so I could just play the Field of Ruin, blow out my opponent's Inkmoth Nexus, and survive the Infect kill. Or I can play the Tireless Tracker and then hope he goes more in on the Infect plan, and then maybe like waste a few counters from an Arcbound Ravager on his Inkmoth Nexus, or on his Inkmoth Nexus. He didn't have enough to kill me on board, so I was hoping to avoid like Cranial Plating, and I think Cranial Plating was actually the only card that kills me, so I'm hoping to avoid Cranial Plating. I had already taken 1 out of his hand earlier on in the game with a Thoughtseize or Inquisition effect, something along those lines. So I made the risky play of playing out Tireless Tracker instead of just playing the Field of Ruin, and my opponent goes a little bit in more on this Infect plan. They try to hit me again. I go to 8 Infect, and then the next turn I play out the Field of Ruin, blow up the Inkmoth Nexus, and survive the Infect plan. So my opponent's done like no damage to me regular, but has me at 8 Infect, and so now I'm kind of restabilizing after this Field of Ruin. I have a Tireless Tracker on board. I play a Tarmogoyf or something like that afterwards, and then just end up getting there from there. And then in game 2, my opponent Thoughtseized me on turn 1 and took away like my only threat. I had nothing but like answers now and no threats, and then my next 3 draws are Tarmogoyf, Tireless Tracker. So my hand goes from just being super reactive and not having any, pressure, to now having reactive spells and pressure. So I played out the 2 whatchamacallit, I played out the 2 Tarmogoyfs, and then from there the 2 Tarmogoyfs just got there, and I was able to, be reactive with the other reactive spells in my hand. And so I ended up getting there 2-0 against Affinity, which puts me up to 3-1 now in the tournament. After playing Affinity, I played against a very interesting deck. This was the first time I had seen something like this. So it was kind of a mixture between Mardu Pyromancer, which is a deck that pretty much everyone is familiar with at this point. You're trying to play Young Pyromancer and then a bunch of fantastic spells. A little bit of graveyard shenanigans going on as well with Bedlam Reveler, Lingering Souls, and Faithless Looting. Then it also had different aspects of Grixis control to it as well. It was playing Snapcasters, it was playing Tassigurs, it was playing Logic Knot, so it was almost, I don't think it was playing Cryptic Command, it was playing Jace the Mind Sculptor as well, so it was almost like a Grixis Pyromancer deck that was splashing white for Lingering Souls, if that makes any sense. So the mana base was pretty greedy on it. There was a lot of, like, I'm sure if my opponent would have played the Sun and Moon opponent that I played in round 1, then he would have probably just lost to a Blood Moon very, very easily. But it was a super sweet deck. It played a bunch of colors, but it played a bunch of powerful spells because he was in all these colors. So it was like Grixis Pyromancer featuring white for Lingering Souls. And I ended up winning this one 2-1. In game 1, I just kind of got there, beat him through like all of his spells. He cast like 1 Pyromancer, I answered it, and then my Tarmogoyf just started beating in. He answered the Tarmogoyf, I played another Tarmogoyf, and he didn't have like the second answer for it because he was playing like Lightning Bolts and Kolagon's Command, and my Tarmogoyf was big enough to survive those at that point. After game 1, game 2 happened, and my opponent beat me. It took an extremely long time. It was a very, very grindy game, but my opponent ended up getting there in the end. I conceded for time reasons. I looked at the clock and we only had like 10 minutes left, so I wasn't quite dead yet, but I knew my opponent had pretty much a lock on this game. They had just resolved. My opponent was also playing Champion of Wits, which is just like super sweet. So he had just gotten to eternalize a Champion of Wits, so he just drew 4 cards and then got to pitch 2. So I knew he was in an extremely good position, so for time reasons I conceded the game even though I wasn't just dead yet. And so then we went to game 3. I had a Grafdigger's Cage, not at my opener, but in the game earlier, I didn't really have the Grafdigger's Cage, and I think I had it in my ending hand, but I didn't want to, like, I was pretty much dead at this point, and I didn't want to show my opponent that I had Grafdigger's Cage. So in game 3, after we had, gone the first few turns, just kind of like grinding each other back and forth, playing some spells, some creatures, he was removing them, that kind of stuff. I finally got to do a play where he had Young Pyromancer and a token in play with 4 untapped mana. I had Inquisitioned him before, so I knew he had a Snapcaster Mage in hand. So by casting a Grafdigger's Cage, it forces him to use the Snapcaster Mage now, or else he can't flash anything back with a Snapcaster's Mage. So with the Grafdigger's Cage on the stack, he plays his Snapcaster Mage, targets Thoughtscour, Thoughtscours himself, and then the Grafdigger's Cage resolves, and then after that, I get to cast Golgari Charm, which is right here. Golgari Charm says, all creatures get -1/-1 until end of turn, destroy target enchantment, or regenerate each creature you control. I went with all creatures get -1/-1 until end of turn, so I killed Snapcaster Mage, killed Young Pyromancer, killed 2 Young Pyromancer Elemental tokens, and my opponent's graveyard was now shut off because I had Grafdigger's Cage, so I kind of baited my opponent into playing out their Snapcaster Mage with the Grafdigger's Cage, which ended up working out super, super well for me, and so I ended up winning that one 2-1. Managed to get it done in the time limit too, which was very nice. So at this point I am 4-1. Like I said, I need to be 5-1 in order to make it into the top 8. And so again, I get stuck against Black Red Holo 1. I already beat this deck 2-0 earlier on in the tournament, so I was feeling okay. But game 1 happened, and game 1, my opponent just got me. At this point, I'm kind of just like, well, I'm out of this, but we'll keep playing. So I had some like good sideboard cards to bring in, like I talked about earlier, and I drew a couple of the good sideboard cards. Like I drew Grafdigger's Cage again in game 2, I believe, and then eventually we got to the point where my Tarmogoyfs were just bigger than his Gurmag Anglers, which was fantastic because that's the biggest creature in his deck. The Holo ones are 4/4s, the Gurmag Anglers are 5/5, so if I have a 5/6 Tarmogoyf, it can block basically anything he's trying to do outside of a Flameblade Adept because of the Menace ability, and the Flamewake Phoenix because of the Flying ability. So in game 2, I ended up just getting there. The game ended with me playing Kalidas, and then following it up the next turn, my opponent had Hollow One Gurmag Angler, Hollow One Gurmag, or two Hollow Ones Gurmag Angler, and a Street Wraith in play. And I had Tassiger, Kalidas, and a Tarmogoyf in play. So it's a very even matchup at this point, but my opponent's pretty low on life total. My opponent's only at 8 or something like that, but he has like no cards in hand. I only have like 2 cards in hand, and so I Damnation, which wipes the board. I get stuck with 8 zombie tokens from the Kalidas, making my opponents die. So I have these 8 2/2s now. My opponent's at 8 life, and I think that I can just kind of get there with these 2/2s, and that's exactly what happens. I end up winning game 2 by attacking with all the 2/2s, and then in game 3, my opponent, same thing happened that ended up happening in game 2, where I got my Tarmogoyfs big enough to deal with the Gurmag Anglers and the Hollow Ones, and I just ended up getting there in the end. I drew Scavenging Ooze as well, so I was able to eat the Flameblade Adepts and the Bloodghast out of his graveyard, which meant I won this match 2-1, and I was now into the top 8. I was 5-1, which meant that I was the 2 seed. The Black-Red Vengevine player, he ended up being the 1 seed, and then I was the 2 seed. I can recall 7 of the 8 decks in the top 8. It was Green-Black Rock, Jund Vengevine, or Black-Red Vengevine, Affinity, Bern, Humans, Tron, Ponza, and Clan Ironworks were 7 of the 8. I can't recall what the 8th one was, but I know what 7 of the 8 were. So that was 7 of the top 8 decks. And so in round 1 of the top 8, I get stuck playing against Humans. This matchup is kind of okay for me. It ended up going better than I kind of thought it would. I just have so many removal spells, which works out very nicely against my opponent who's trying to play a bunch of creature spells. I have Damnation and I have Languish on the sideboard to ruin my opponent's day, pretty much. So game 1, my opponent got there. I kept kind of a sketchy hand because I didn't know what he was on, and so it ended up just being too slow to beat Humans. Game 2, I ended up just getting there. I had a bunch of removal spells for his creatures, and then my creatures just got there because my creatures were, bigger than what he could make his creatures, especially after I cleared the board in the early game. It was very important that I took a controlling role in this matchup. My opponent was definitely the aggro player in the matchup, and I was more of the control player, just trying to answer his threats and then eventually slam a Tassiger or a Tarmogoyf that was big enough to, start attacking. And then in Game 3, my opponent kind of got a little bit mana screwed. His lands in play were Cavern of Souls, Basic Plains, and Horizon Canopy, and my opponent cannot cast Mantis Rider off of those 3 lands. So I Field of Ruin I don't. I make sure not to Field of Ruin the opponent quite yet. Eventually he plays an Aether Vial, and I know I have to Maelstrom Pulse the Aether Vial, because if the Aether Vial gets up to 3, he can start playing his Mantis Riders with his Aether Vial, which means that he can, start getting around that. Eventually, I Field of Ruin his Cavern of Souls. He has to find the basic island in his deck. I know that he only has 2 basics, because earlier on in the game, or earlier on in the match, in Game 2, he had Basic Plains in play, he had Basic Island in play. I Field of Ruined him, and he didn't search. Well, he shuffled because you have to shuffle for Field of Ruin, but he didn't put a land into play. So I wrote down that he only had 2 basics in play, and to keep that in mind. So I knew that I was able to use the Field of Ruins very effectively in this part of the matchup, where my opponent had the Mantis Riders in hand, but just couldn't cast them, and that I needed to try and keep them off of that as much as I could. So I ended up doing that. My opponent complimented me after the game. He said you played that game perfectly. I don't know what I could have done differently, and I said, thank you. That's, super cool. I appreciate the compliment. Opponent was a very nice guy, and it's always a fantastic compliment, hearing that you played perfectly. That's, something that is extremely, extremely unlikely in Magic, but hearing it from my opponent, he was very impressed with my play, and it was super, super cool of him to say that. So I'm on to the top 4 now after winning 2-1 versus Humans, and I get to play against Bern. Bern is a fantastic matchup for me, so I am extremely, extremely happy with this. Bern does not do very well against Collective Brutality, because all 3 of the modes are fantastic against Bern. I get to gain back life, I get to kill their small creatures, and I get to take instants and sorceries out of their hands, which is fantastic against them. And then I also have Scavenging Ooze as well to start gaining back a little bit of life and making a big enough creature to start blocking as well. So I felt like I was in a fantastic position at this point. And then I had like Obstinate Bailouts on the sideboard and Engineered Explosives I think I brought in as well. I don't know if I brought in anything else. I think I brought in Golgari Charms because Golgari Charms say destroy target enchantment, and so it can hit Eidolon of the Great Revel. So I think that was just better than like some of the other slower cards that I had. Like I think Leon of the Veil is just too slow in the matchup. And some of the other cards like Thoughtseize, you don't want to play Thoughtseize against Bern. So I boarded in the Golgari Charms too, just as kind of like a hedge against Eidolon of the Great Revel because it was better than the other cards I had in my main deck. So game one, I got a Scavenging Ooze, which meant I basically won the game. I got to cast Collective Brutality twice too, so it was pretty much over for my opponent. Game two, my opponent did get me. They had double Eidolon of the Great Revel in play, which was pretty hard for me, and I kind of misplayed a little bit when he cast so the first Eidolon of the Great Revel was in play. He goes to cast the second one, and I play Cast Down targeting the first Eidolon of the Great Revel with the second one still on the stack. I should have let it resolve, taken 2 from the Eidolon attacking, and then cast Maelstrom Pulse the next turn to take care of both Eidolons. Instead, I ended up using 2 of my cards to take care of the 2 creatures instead of just using 1 card, and so that kind of ended up coming back to bite me later on. So I did end up losing game 2, but then in game 3 I got there again. I had, the Collective Brutalities, I had another Scavenging Ooze, and I just, ended up getting there. I think I cast an Obstinate Bailout towards the end as well, and my opponent was on a mulligan to like 6 or 5, something like that, and I started with like an Inquisition on him, so I was pretty much ripping his hand apart. He started essentially with 5 cards after the Inquisition, so it was pretty nice for me, and I ended up taking this one 2-1 against Bern. So I am now on to the finals of the PPTQ, where I get to play against Ironworks Combo. Ironworks Combo, for those of you that don't know, takes a million years to kill you, but the way that it works is Scrap Trawler and Mirror Retriever along with Clan Ironworks to create a bunch of mana. Then you can essentially cycle through your deck using cards like Chromatic Sphere, Chromatic Star, Terrarian, Mind Stone, Ichor Wellspring, those kind of cards to just cycle through your entire deck until you get to play a Pyrite Spellbomb and kill your opponent by activating Pyrite Spellbomb a bunch of times. And so my opponent ended up losing game 1. I got there after starting with 3 discard spells, turn 1 Inquisition into turn 2 Inquisition plus Thoughtseize, so I was in a fantastic spot, and then after that I just played a Tarmogoyf and then beat him to death with the Tarmogoyf. And then in game 2, my opponent ended up getting there. My opponent had to work through a Damping Sphere. Damping Sphere was another card that I brought in against this matchup because they're trying to cast a bunch of spells when they're trying to go, infinite with this Scrap Trawler loop, and so making them spend even more mana on it is, crucial. And so my opponent had to work through the Damping Sphere. My opponent worked through it and ended up getting there. He dug through his deck enough to find a Nature's Claim to blow up my Damping Sphere, and so my opponent got there. And then in game 3, my opponent just killed me on turn 3 after I played like turn 1 discard spell, turn 2 Tarmogoyf, turn 3 like something else, but it was probably like a Tireless Tracker or something, and my opponent just like killed me on turn 3 or something like that. It was not a fun time. Actually, I think he killed me on turn 4. I got to attack with the Tarmogoyf once. Yeah. Yeah, I think that sounds right. So I was dead very early on in the game. It didn't feel like it was very early on in the game because the combo takes quite a long time to, truly kill you. But of course, since it's the finals, I'm gonna make my opponent, go through their deck until they can find the loop. And I'm not just gonna concede in the finals like that, especially when it's game 3. There's a lot on the line. So ended up losing this one 1-2 in the finals to Clan Ironworks. This deck is fantastic, but my deck is also fantastic too. I highly recommend Green Black Rock. This is my third. The last 3 PPTQs that I've played, I've top 8'd all 3 of them. One of them was standard with the mono green splash black Stompy list before M19 came out, and then last week I played with Green Black Rock and I took 8th, and then this week I played with Green Black Rock and I took 2nd. I ended up walking away with $200 plus a pack of Onslaught, so that was kind of cool as my prizes. You guys can see the picture on your screen now. The tournament organizer took pictures, the store owner took pictures, and so you can see my smiley face here with my $200 $10 in my pack of Onslaught. So hopefully you guys did enjoy this video. I love getting to make these videos. Talking about competitive Magic is something that I truly enjoy, and so whenever I do well in a tournament, I love getting the chance to talk about it with you guys. So let me know your thoughts down low in the comments. What are your opinions on some of the decks that I got to play against? What are your opinions on my green-black rock deck? Be sure to let me know. How do you guys do at PPTQs? Especially if you played in one recently, go ahead and let me know how you did. And with that being said, thank you guys so much for watching the video. Be sure to leave a like if you enjoyed, subscribe to the channel if you're new, and I will see you guys here next time for another Magic the Gathering video. Thank you guys so much for watching today's video where I did a tournament report talking about the green-black rock deck that I took to a second place finish out of 62 players in a PPTQ yesterday. It was a lot of fun getting to play the deck, and of course I would like to say thank you to all of my patrons, Jason F., Jeremy W., and BadWolfMTG. You three are fantastic people. If you guys are interested in checking out the Patreon page, the link will be down low in the description, and I will see you guys here next time for another Magic the Gathering video. Thanks for watching.